We're going to talk about the legislative summary. What happened in this session of the legislature. Those of you who've been sitting in on the sessions, the previous two sessions to this, already got a lot of this from the league staff that were there, which they did a really good job. But let me tell you, first of all, when I put this presentation together, and I usually try to find pictures that are appropriate, I thought, yeah, given what happened in this legislative session, this picture is probably quite appropriate because so much stuff regarding land use happened in this legislative session, was passed, and is requiring something to be done. I didn't even know how prescient that was because this is the fourth time I'll have done a legislative update for this last session to some kind of a group. Fourth time. Every time before this that I've done it, I have never gotten through all of the stuff. I haven't been able to get through all of the stuff, and I can pretty well tell you I'm not going to get through all of it today, too, I bet. Unless we're in a little bit more of a setting where I think I can just glide through it because it's not really set up very well to do questions. So I will glide through it fairly quickly. The league session that was just prior to this, Carson had, where are you, Carson? Are you in here? I saw him in here a minute ago. Anyway, he put together a detailed summary of all of the bills and what they did. He didn't even get through, I would say, 10% of it in that session. So there's a lot here. So maybe we need to quit talking and just get into this. As I said, there was so much new added. There were 40 bills that related to land use in some way that were introduced in this legislative session. I will tell you, from having done this since 1990, that's a lot of bills for land use. That was a lot of bills. 25 of them passed, and that's a lot too. Here's what I have been watching the last couple of years. The LUDMA, which for most of you know what that is, but it's the Land Use Development and Management Act. It's the enabling legislation or the enabling code for cities and counties to do land use, planning and regulation. The version that we have now was adopted into the state code in 2006. And it was, reasonably compact. The original, of course, was based on the state enabling legislation from the 1930s, the 1920s. It had changed some since. In 2006, it was substantially modified. Actually, in the 1990s, it was modified quite a bit. In 2006, it was really changed quite a bit. But it was still fairly succinct and fairly easy. That thing has grown into a monster. And in just this legislative session, there were 765 lines of code that were added to the LUDMA. Last year, there were like 300 and something lines added, and I thought that was a lot. And the year before that, again, around 300 some odd lines that were added to the LUDMA. I really defy you now to sit down, go through the LUDMA, and figure out everything you're supposed to be doing and make sure that you're complying with it. It is, it's almost an impossible task at this point. And the other part that's been happening lately that I find somewhat not good is that there are land use provisions now that are being stuck into other sections of the state code. Here's a list of the other sections of state code in this legislative session that these bills put provisions regarding land use into. If you are a planner or a land use attorney, that you're trying to get familiar with what it is that you're supposed to be doing at the local government level with regard to land use, or if you're a developer and you want to know what the rules are that you have to play by, and you go, where are you going to go look? You're going to go look at the LUDMA, right? That's what everybody has pretty much done in the past. You can have any idea that you should be looking in the Higher Education Act for something that relates to land use, or in the powers of, maybe in the powers of municipality, but retail incentive payments section. I mean, it's remarkable all of the things that have been added and that they've been added to other parts of state code. And who the hell knows that they're there? Only if you have some particular involvement with it. I work with the Utah Land Use Institute. Craig Call has been doing a great job in putting together a library. The Ombudsman's office also has a great library available. Jordan, you guys are doing a great job with that. I think we need to put together an index of where all the provisions regarding land use exist in the state code now so that they can be at least found. So, isn't this a cheerful way to start off this summary? So let's talk. We're also going to have Zach Smallwood, who is with Murray City, who is now the co-chair, a legislative co-chair for APA Utah. I needed to have a co-chair because I've been doing this for, what do we figure now, 35 years? My wife keeps telling me, you're retired, stop doing this. Someday I got to stop, but I haven't been able to find anybody that really could or would want to pick it up. Zach has got the brain damage and decided that he might want to do this. So he's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the other provisions there. But usually I organize this by bill numbers. I say, here's the bill that was passed, here's what's in the bill, and what you need to know. What I found this year was that it probably made more sense to just talk about the topics, the subject areas, because sometimes the same topic was covered in several different bills. Or one bill, and there was one particular bill this session that covered a whole lot of topic areas, and makes it a little bit more make more sense to cover this by topic areas. So I'll start off with general plans. The first thing is that there was a bill that was passed, Senate Bill 195, that now will require, and after a lot of back and forth on this bill, this is what it requires. All communities that are within an MPO, a Metropolitan Planning Organization, that is Wasatch Front Regional Council, Mountain Lands Association of Government, the Cache MPO, and the, what's the one in St. George called? Dixie MPO, I think? Oh, it's called Five County MPO, okay. All of the communities within those MPOs are now required to modify or to reconsider their transportation and circulation element in the general plan, to identify priority connections to remedy physical impediments that would improve circulations. This whole thing kind of got started by the fact that we were having things where like communities would run streets, they'd come to a canal, and they either wouldn't or couldn't cross that canal, or there were other reasons why they weren't connecting streets, and it sort of became an issue. And UDOT was finding it to be an issue too, as they were trying to do their planning for their system and figuring out where traffic was going to come from and how it would work. So after a lot of back and forthing as to what just ought to be in this bill, communities in these MPOs are now required by July 1st of 2027 to modify their transportation and circulation elements, to identify those connections, and to get more specific in those plans. In your plan, this is what doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but again, it's where you sometimes get the input and you're not really sure what you're doing. In the plan, you have to include cost estimates for making those connections, the potential funding sources for covering those costs, and the impediments to constructing those. That's getting pretty darn specific. Very rarely, hardly ever, do you see that kind of specificity that needs to be put into your general plan. That's really more stuff. Your traffic and circulation general plan has traditionally been a place where you talk about, as much of your general plan, more general things, and then you get more specific as you do like your transportation plan for your community. That's really where that stuff belongs, but it's now in your general plan. It has to be in your general plan. What worries me a little bit about that is by setting a precedent and saying that there will be other things now that you have to do with that regard. That's not the place for it. And we maybe need to do something to talk to folks at the legislative level to say, we need to change this and not require this. That's not what a general plan is intended to be. Regardless, having said that at this point, it's there. It's required now. You got to have it done according to the state code here by July 1st, 2027. Okay? Something to be aware of. In addition to the water element that y'all got the requirement to do a couple of years ago, in addition to the fun one, moderate income housing element. which that whole moderate housing income plan, which had been a separate part of the state code, was added into general plans a couple of years ago. That was probably appropriate. That was probably a good place to put it, but the moderate income housing plan thing itself turned into quite a deal with the whole housing affordability crisis. Not inappropriately, but it's had a lot of issues and things. And I am not the great expert on moderate income housing plans. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here, Zach Smallwood, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the moderate income housing plans requirements, things that were in this legislation, and what may be happening in the future, because folks, it sounds like there may be some changes, potentially big changes, coming on moderate income housing plans, but we don't know what those will be yet.
Hello, everyone. Can I grab the clicker? Thank you. So my name's Zach Smallwood. I am the planning manager over in Murray City, down in Salt Lake County. I apologize. This is my first time presenting at a conference, so I am terribly nervous, and in front of a bunch of colleagues. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. So yeah, I'm just going to go over very quickly. So overall, this year for moderate income housing, it was pretty quiet as far as reporting and things are concerned. They did add some enabling language, which I'll get into here. They added 3 new menu items and then reorganized a couple so that you could include those as part of your housing plan. So they added AA, which is, approve a project that receives funding from or qualifies to receive funding from the Utah Homes Incentive Program. And then also 2 density incentive bonuses. So either BB or CC. One is for a single-family residential bonus or multifamily incentive bonus. So really quickly, just affordable home ownership for the single family. So if you do not have a zone that allows for 6 units per acre, the state says just bump that up to 6. If you do have single family that you want to make a little more dense, bump that up by at least half a unit per acre. And there's some other things that you have to do in there as well, but those are the large chunks, and I think the exciting part of that, I know in Murray we've had a discussion with our mayor, and he's very supportive of doing that, mostly for what I'll get into here in a second. But the multifamily residential is having a zone that has 20 residential units per acre. This does include an affordable element to it as well. So what's really exciting about this, so the benefits, so it allows for a lower number of strategies overall. So you communities that have fixed guideways, you have to have 5 strategies. This actually reduces it down to 3 if you pick one of those from X to CC. And if you do not have a fixed rail station, then that one of those counts for 3 of your moderate income housing choices. Also, it includes less reporting, which we all love. So it will include your initial reporting year and then 2 consecutive years. So you pretty much get a 3-year break from reporting to actually get that through the system, which I know from my stress level goes to July 31st when I'm submitting the report, and then I have a 1-month reprieve, and then I get about 90 days worrying whether I actually made the cut and got approved. And then by that time, it's the following year, and now I'm starting to stress about whether we're meeting everything that we said we were going to do in the first place. So getting a couple years off, I think, would be really, really, really helpful. So, and what I will caveat is that you've probably all heard this in previous sessions. The state is starting or has already begun a statewide housing plan, which is moving forward at a rapid pace. And that's another thing that I wanted to touch on, because that's what's going to be next. I fully anticipate that it will result in some changes to moderate income housing reporting, plans, everything going forward. So, as part of HB 37, this legislature required that. I already just talked about this. But APA membership has a unique opportunity to contribute as a profession and not necessarily from your individual city's perspective. I think that's very important. It's something that us as a profession haven't done yet very strongly, and Wilf and I really want to pursue that as just a profession instead of being a representative of your city. So with that, there are 3 work groups. So I couldn't fit them all onto one slide very well. So there you go. So I'm going to be putting together a group of planners here. I'm going to try to separate them depending on how many people I get to volunteer, so I hope you all do, to separate into these 5 work groups to review the over 140 tactics that the state is working towards right now. They don't plan on adopting all 140 tactics, but helping to inform the plan going forward, which will then inform the 2026 legislative session. So, as you can see, work group 1 is really focused on those unsheltered, rapid housing, transitional housing, and permanent supportive. Work group 2 is for subsidized, affordable, restricted workforce and starter and first-time homes with subsidy. That work group 3 is for market rate rentals, market rate ownership, and then starter and first homes with no subsidy. Work group 4 is for rural and resort communities. And then work group 5 is for infrastructure, location of housing, administrative and legislative actions, and then statewide standards. So really that's all I have to say about MIH right now. What I do, if you scan this QR code, you can send me an email. And if you're interested in getting involved, let me know. I'll be putting that together. As Wilf had mentioned, they are on a really tight timeline. I think it's June 16th or 18th. We need to have some of those comments done. So probably early next week, I will be sending out emails, replying to emails and asking for additional information. If you're sending me an email, just if you already know what kind of work group you're interested in, that would be really helpful so I can start to go through those a little bit more. Or you can text me, because sometimes email's weird. So I'll leave my contact info, and then also I'll be here after this as well to answer any questions or get more contact. So I'll turn it back over to Wilf to continue his slides. Thanks.
I'll just get that slide there. While Zach's doing that, just real quick to get you involved there, we thought it was really important, and Jason Bowl, our chapter president, really wants to make sure that we get the word, the involvement of planners as professionals out there. The league is, of course, very much involved in doing this. They talked about this in their last session. Many planners work through the league, but what we're really getting there is the perspective of the cities and the towns. The planners help inform that a lot of the times, but that may not be it. And we have planners that are not just at cities and towns. We have planners that work at the state level, at the federal level. We have planners that are involved with private consulting groups, with development projects and private developers. So it would be good to get the feedback and the frame of reference of the planners as a profession, and that's what's intended here and why we're doing this as a group, as an association, to provide the feedback from planners specifically. So hope you get involved there, and we'll do that. All right, that was moderate income housing plans. As I say, I'm running out of time again already on a lot of this, but we'll skate through this and give you an idea of the various things that this year's legislation covered and that you need to know about. As far as local ordinances, changing your local ordinances, every year the legislature passes stuff, and you're generally expected at the county and the city level to change your local codes to be in compliance with the state code. These are some of the provisions that were passed in bills in this year's session that you need to take a look at and potentially, depending on your size of your community, the location of your community, making changes to your own local code. One is provisions for allowing for identical housing plans. The idea there is builders will oftentimes build the same plan multiple times. Why does it need to go through a new review and a new fee for that review every time they bring in essentially the same plan? Yes, you probably need to take a look at it in terms of, does it meet the zoning requirements, the setback and other things like that, and the foundation and the connections. But other than that, the rest of the structure, you've probably already reviewed it. So the idea here is to have a provision, a way to allow for identifying what identical housing plans are, which then allows them at a much reduced fee and with a very short time frame to get the review done, which the idea there being this would help with the cost of housing. And it may well do. But that's a provision you may need to take a look at and modifying your own local code for. Public hearing for variances and land use appeals are now prohibited by state code. Some jurisdictions in their own ordinances, one of the ones that I worked for, Salt Lake City at the time, required public hearing for a land use appeal or for a variance. It's a quasi-judicial process. It's based on the facts and the information specific to a particular instance or a property. Doesn't seem to be a lot of call for or need for public hearings. You don't see courts holding public hearings. This is a very similar process to that. The idea there being that then they're not required. So state code now prohibits public hearings at that level. If your code or ordinance allows for that or calls for that, you need to probably make a change there. There was a lot of discussion about parking standards. Nationally, the issue of parking has become kind of a bellwether on affordable housing, because the idea there being that oftentimes too much parking is required for what's really needed for housing projects as well as for other uses. And some places go far beyond housing, and generally there have been a number of jurisdictions around the country that at this point have just done away with parking requirements altogether. Nobody seems to be quite ready to go there here yet, but there was a lot of discussion about it. This is what came out in the legislative session. That for in the cities that are required to file or to have and file reports on their moderate income housing plans, for 1 and 2 family units and for townhomes, there are now parking standards in state code that you must adopt, that you must conform with. That includes the size of the parking space, what's considered the size for a parking space, and where they can be located, either internal or external. And then there's even a provision that relates to whether you can even require a garage for a certain type of housing unit having to do with affordability and moderate income housing. So you need to be aware of that and take a look at that. There sometimes communities, before they will issue a building permit, they say, well, you have to have a street in place, or you have to have a certain standard left so that a fire truck could get to the house if it burns. That's varied amongst communities. There was some desire to put some uniformity to that, so there are now provisions in the state code that talk about what kinds of street improvements and also fire improvements, like fire hydrants and whether they have to be charged or not and how far away, in order for you to be able to issue a building permit and even a certificate of occupancy. Sometimes you'll have a house that's completed in the wintertime. The developer cannot get around to paving the street before the weather warms up. Some communities have said, well, until the street's paved, you don't get a certificate of occupancy. The people who have bought the house, they've bought it, they're paying for it, they can't even move into it. And yet, based on some of these standards, they probably would be able to and still meet the safety requirements. So there are provisions for that now in the state code. You see the level of specificity we're getting to now in the LUDMA? You know, we're dealing with these kinds of issues, whereas before, provisions used to be fairly general. But because of things that happen out in the world as things go along and, the complaints that come in and everything, we get more and more and more detailed. And that's why LUDMA is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because we're dealing with all kinds of issues like this. And so I don't know how to get around that. It's probably just a fact of human nature. We tend to do these kind of things. All right, enough editorializing. The way you do bonds, inspections, and then bond releases for public improvements and for landscaping, there are provisions regarding to that in the state code. I won't get into the specifics. If I got into the specifics of all of these bills, we'd be here till 5 o'clock this evening. You all don't want to do that, and I don't want to do that. So, but just be aware that that's there. You need to find out what that is and make sure that you comply with that. And then transfer development right provisions. That one's fairly innocuous. What all the bill there says is that if you're going to do transfers outside of your jurisdiction, allow for transfers of development rights outside of your jurisdiction, you have to have an agreement with the other entity to do that. To me, I'm going like, well, duh. How could you transfer your development rights to another jurisdiction unless the other jurisdiction agreed to take it? So anyway, it says in the state code now you have to do that. So stormwater runoff controls, permits, and inspections. There was a whole bill that dealt with that. That's been an issue for a few years now because of federal requirements that have been in place and how to deal with it at the local level. So you need to be aware of that, about how you deal with stormwater runoff, particularly during construction, like construction of new subdivisions or new buildings. Something that you need to take a look at there. There was a bill that dealt with property line adjustments. Adjusting if two property owners want to adjust the property line between them for whatever reason, and it happens. And it's something that was not real well defined in code, how that needed to happen and what happened there. There was a desire expressed particularly by the folks that oftentimes are called upon to deal with that, like the surveyors and engineers, that people might call upon them to draw up the new documents for the new property lines. And the process, they were kind of getting something different in each jurisdiction. There is now a bill that was passed that sets out the process for property line adjustments, whether it's between subdivision lots or whether it's properties that are not in subdivisions. And it's quite detailed. It's very detailed. When I first saw the bill, I was like, holy cow. I can't imagine that planners and people are going to be real thrilled about how detailed this bill is and everything that it requires. I asked a couple of people to take a look at it. Generally, the comments back were, no, it's probably not a bad thing to do because it really sets out in detail specificity of how to get this done and kind of does away with some of the ambiguity that used to be there, which was not a bad thing. Apparently, a lot of us didn't read it real close because there are problems with this bill. And I think there's going to have to be some adjustments made to it. Partly, I don't know with the specificity of it and the length of it, that may be part of what happens, but there are some provisions in there that just really shouldn't have been there. And I have to admit, and I do a mea culpa on this, and I think others do as well, there was so much stuff coming through in the legislature this session that a lot of us just felt like, if you get somebody that says, yeah, it looks okay, that you just go, great, fine, I'm not going to worry about it then, and we'll just let it go. And to me, that's what happened on this bill. I probably should have sat down and read the damn thing all the way through and taken a look at what was in it because, for example, and this is probably the most glaringly obvious thing that shouldn't be there, is you all may be well aware that we are trying to do away with having public hearings for administrative actions because it doesn't work. State code does not require it. Sometimes local ordinances do. But the idea is generally to get away from having public hearings for administrative actions because what's the public do when they show up? They give you opinion. They don't give you the kind of information that you generally need to make an administrative decision. This bill says that in order to do a property line adjustment, there has to be a public hearing. Should not be there, all right? So that needs to be taken out. There are some other provisions in this bill that need to be probably relooked at and modified as well. So, and yet, it's there. All of these bills came into effect yesterday. So, good luck, folks. We'll see how it works. All right. High tunnels, which are a place to store like hay and things like that in agricultural areas, they are now exempt from regulation in counties, which is really interesting to me because I thought they were. They're exempt in cities, but they weren't exempt in counties. So now this bill made them exempt in counties as well. Counties have had the provision in place for some time now to do what's a minor subdivision, where improvements are not required and the extensive subdivision process is not required. That used to be 100 acres. You had to have at least 100 acres in order to do this, to carve off a lot out of 100 acres and not go through the subdivision process, and it couldn't be within 1,000 feet of another one that was doing this. That all got cut in half, basically, by this bill. Now it's 50 acres and 500 feet. There was a whole bill that dealt with gravel pit regulation. Gravel pits have been a real source of contention for some time. There have been a lot of lawsuits. There's been a lot of back and forth at the legislature. For the last couple of years, there's kind of been a truce or a ceasefire that had been taking place, and you had discussions going on between local governments and the operators of gravel pits with hopefully the idea that they could come up with something workable. They never really did. But the bill was passed this session that at first was kind of touted as being, okay, we've come to, you know, there's been some agreement on this. Well, there really wasn't agreement on it. And it really puts a lot of provisions out there that gives operators a lot of the ability to do things that they've been wanting to do and limits a lot of what local government can do. This issue is not over by any means. There is the whole issue of we got to have sand and gravel if we're going to grow. And it affects the cost of housing too, because you got to have concrete and you've got to have all of the stuff that goes into building. And if we're going to not have nearby sources of sand and gravel, it's going to get a lot more expensive to haul it in from elsewhere. So there's a point to doing this. And yet, those operations have quite an impact on nearby residences and other uses. And so there's got to be something that, you know, it's the rock and the hard place. Ha, pun. But literally, there's quite a discrepancy here on what to do with it. There will certainly be something happen. And I just noticed as I got up and was just before I got ready to come down here, lo and behold, in today's newspaper, one of the newspapers, who reads the newspaper these days anymore? Anyway.
Well, no one reads the physical.
Yeah, that's right. You read them online, right? That's what I did. I read it online. There is a story about gravel pits and the issues with regard to gravel pits. So this one is certainly going to come back. But there are provisions in there now that if you have a gravel pit in your community, you need to be aware of this, and there are limitations on what you can do in terms of regulating them, or there are rules in place for how you can deal with them, okay? There was a bill that was passed for a process for determining a similar unlisted business use. The idea here is this. A lot of us in our commercial zones, we list the kinds of uses, the kinds of businesses that can be located in there. A lot of times we'll also, the code will also have a provision in it that says, if it's not listed here specifically, then it's not allowed. Or I have seen a number of codes that also say, or other similar uses, right? Now what's considered to be a similar use? I've worked for several jurisdictions, 3 primary big ones in my career. In each of those cases, we have had a process for determining if a use is similar. It's basically like an administrative hearing. Somebody comes in and says, I want to do this. You go, well, it isn't really listed in our code, but it might be similar. have a process set up to have a determination made as to whether it's considered similar or not. If it is considered similar, great, then they can go ahead and go in that zone. If it's considered not to be similar, they're out of luck. But then, of course, the next thing you tell them is, if you want to try and get it added to the code, you can go through the code amendment process, which is, of course, a legislative process, amending your zoning code. And that seems to have worked reasonably well. This bill showed up this session, which basically said, this is a kind of process you have to set up, and it requires jurisdictions to have this process in your code. So I took a look at it. I thought, well, this sounds just like what we've been doing. And then all of a sudden I saw a provision in there that just rang the alarm bells in my head, because what it said was that if you then go to the legislative body, to the council, to have them make a determination as to whether it should be allowed or not, and they decide not to allow it, then the next thing that happens is you go to an administrative hearing. And the alarm bell that went off in my head was, what the hell? You're taking a legislative decision, and now you're saying it goes to an administrative appeals process? That is completely out of character, in line with how we do land use and how it's legally been done in the state of Utah for a long time. Well, as I talked to a couple of legal experts, they said, no, it doesn't say in that provision, in that bill, that you're amending the code. That's not at all what's happening. It's kind of like the council is being asked to make a one-off decision. I said, well, to me that sounds like a use variance, and use variances are not allowed either. And the response to that was, it's not really a variance either, it's more like a special exception. They're right. I mean, that's really what it seems to be like, but we took special exceptions out of the state code several years ago. So I happened to be at an event, and one of the people at the event happened to be the person that had been the instigator of this bill and had worked with the Senate sponsor. And he had read, I got kind of impassioned about this and blogged about it, and he had read it. He came up to me after the event and he says, hey, I'm the guy that was working and did this. And he says, I agree with you, there's a problem with what the bill says. And I said, oh, great, then we need to fix it. And he said, I agree, we need to fix it. So we've since had some discussions about fixing it. But the other part of that is that he and the organization that he works with, their intent was, of course, to try and help business, private sector, and they were then intending, and are still intending, on putting out a model language for communities to adopt into their code in order to enact what's in this bill. And I said, well, what are you going to write now that we've all agreed that there's a problem with the language of this bill? And he says, well, we don't want to wait. And I said, I get that, but you don't want to write this wrong process in there either. And he said, no, let's work on it together and get it the way it should be written, and then we can also modify the bill, and that will probably have to happen in the next legislative session. So you are now required, as of yesterday, to have this provision in your code, but don't put it in your code the way it says it in the state law. How should you put it in there? I don't know. We're still working on the model language. So I'm not going to give you the advice to wait and not do this right now. That's enough. That's all I'm going to say about it. All right? You can see the fun we have with legislative stuff, right? All right. These are things that deal with the administration of land use, not things that you necessarily need to change in your code, but in the way you handle land use in your community. The whole requirement for the mailing of notices, when there was a couple of years ago in the legislature, there was a bill that was introduced that revamped how you do public notice for everything that was addressed in the entire Utah State Code, including the LUDMA. There were some provisions in the LUDMA that really didn't fit a lot of the things that were elsewhere in the state code, and so what happened was that there were provisions that put in there that let's say you were going to change your land use requirement in your zoning code You were going to, make a general one that applied to the entire community, or you were going to make a change, like you were going to add something to say, like your commercial zone, or change something in your residential zone. The way the noticing requirement was written in that bill was, in those instances, you would need to notify separately. Usually that means mailing to every single property owner in that area. For some of those things, that could be huge and extremely expensive. So that was pointed out, and there were some changes made in a bill in this session that kind of allows for that not to happen, that you have to do individual mailings to all property owners for big, what they call ministerial actions. When I first saw that term, I thought, what in the heck is a ministerial action? Carson can probably tell us what that means, but I'm not sure. But that's the idea behind it, is to try and get around that provision. So just be aware of that. If you had a year or two ago, there was a provision that was a bill that was adopted that said that if you had an airport in your jurisdiction or adjacent to your jurisdiction, that you had to notify property owners within 2,500 feet that they were by an airport runway. I think the idea there was to, preclude nuisance lawsuits and to, safety issues and everything else. Well, that was for public airports. This year there was a provision adopted into the code that, through this bill that says you have to do that for private airports now as well, but only certain kinds of private airports. You have to meet certain criteria for those airports, so you need to take a look at that. If a state highway is going to be reconstructed, it's going to be modified, rebuilt, something's going to happen with an existing state highway, and there's a billboard on that state highway, and the reconstruction is going to mean that that billboard has to be moved or taken down. There are provisions now that regulate or that dictate how and where that can happen. So be aware of that with regard to billboards. On short-term rentals has been a big issue for some time. And during the housing crisis now, it's become even more of an issue because people are saying short-term rentals, particularly in resort communities, are affecting the ability to have affordable housing. Particularly in a lot of resort communities, you have high-end housing, and it's tough for people that work there, like in the restaurants, maybe the police officers, everybody else that works in that community, tough for them to find a place to live. And a lot of the places they might be able to live, people are now renting them out as short-term rentals. So there just isn't that much housing available. That happens in other places as well, not just in resort communities. There are some provisions now about how you deal with, enforce on short-term rentals and with the licensing of short-term rentals. The idea of licensing them partly being so that you know where they are and what they are doing, and then also to the hotel industry has said it isn't fair. They have to pay tourism taxes, the hotels do, but these short-term rentals oftentimes don't. And so it's not fair, and so that licensing provision is part of, to try and get at that so that it's equally applied across all. All right? Some jurisdictions were saying that they would not issue building permits or more likely certificates of occupancy if landscaping has not been installed or if landscaping plans have not been provided. Again, we've had instances where in some communities, the house is done, people are ready to move in, they're now on the hook for their mortgage, the landscaping's not in because it's December. They're not going to get the landscaping in for 4 or 5 months, and some communities have said, sorry, until you get your landscaping in, we're not going to issue a certificate of occupancy. That then prompted this bill, which does that and a few other things. So sometimes we're our own worst enemies, right? And the way we deal with some of these things, but just be aware that that's there. The whole timeline for deeming an application, a building permit application or a development application, deeming it complete, and then how you do plan resubmittals and plan reviews. There was a bill that dealt with all of that. Carson with the league had a great timeline If you're interested in seeing that, it's a good timeline, good explanation of it, about you have a certain number of days to determine whether an application is complete. Then you have a certain number of days that you can do your review, ask for information. Depending on when the applicant gets you their information back, you may be able to tack on some more times for a review. The baseline being that you get 14 days to review plans, but there are some exceptions that can be made depending on what happens and how. Stuff gets so detailed. You see why I say that I defy anybody to sit down, read the LUDMA, and really completely understand what it is you're required to do? It ain't easy anymore, folks. And again, the whole process of releasing bonds for infrastructure and landscaping as a developer builds, and they've bonded for it, but now they're completing it. And how do you release those bonds, and on what timeline? Once again, a set of rules that have been put in place for that. There were changes made to these housing programs. There haven't been a lot of these that have been implemented, partly because of issues that were with these programs in the first place when they were adopted by the legislature, but there were changes made to the FIS program, changes to the HTRZ program, and station area plan reporting requirements have changed somewhat, as well as some provisions for that. Also housing set-aside funds and the funds from your community redevelopment areas, what they can be used for and how you can use them. There were some changes made to that. There's a little provision in there that says you can't charge a water district that has a certified inspector for inspection fees. Somebody must have had a real issue with that. Anyway, it made it into state legislation. There is a provision, there was a bill, and this came up right near the end of the session. So there wasn't a lot of discussion about this, but it was interesting. The state has provided now a process whereby somebody can go and get themselves certified as being somebody who might have a real risk of being hurt, damaged, killed, whatever, by a security risk. All right? For someone, I mean, the basic idea would be a celebrity, a politician, somebody who might face a lot of death threats or harm threats and so on. Somebody who feels like that they're in that kind of a position, they can go to the state and get certified as being subject or being prone to getting these kinds of things. Once they get that, they have a certain status and they can do certain things. One of the things that they can do is that they can do now things to their property to make it more secure that exempt them from local land use regulations. The most common provision would be like to say to put up a really tall wall or a fence, right? Your local land fencing regulations may not allow for that. If they have been deemed to be a certified risk, they now get to ignore your rules with regard to that. It also would apply to like building heights if they're doing things to do something in that regard. Anything that they may want to do to their property that would be considered to be something that they need for their security, it's now exempt from your local land use regulations. Okay? Something just to be aware of. And then there was a bill that we've been working on for some time with regard to annexations. The annexation code has been a mess for a long, long time for a variety of reasons. We finally got that essentially recodified. There were not a lot of policy changes made to that. It needs policy changes, but there were not a lot made to that so that we could try to get this reorganization passed, and it did pass. The one big change that is included in this bill is that for some time now, since the 1990s, there has been a different annexation process for Salt Lake County from everybody else in the state. And that was because of the particulars of how Salt Lake County worked and the kinds of challenges they were getting. A lot of that has pretty much been settled now, and so this bill now makes it so that Salt Lake County doesn't have their own separate annexation process. It's uniform now throughout the state. So if you're in Salt Lake County, just something to be aware of. All right, just some other interesting, let's see, we probably don't have a lot of time left. Yeah, I got a couple, 3 minutes. Just some other interesting planning-related legislation you may want to be aware of. The energy development zones is an interesting one. This is the idea that a community can say, we want to designate an energy development zone, and what that would mean is that in this area you can allow now for power generation facilities. What it really was intended for, or what it really is meant to embody, is this whole discussion about nuclear, and who's going to want a nuclear power plant in their community, you know? The technology nowadays says that it might not be a bad thing, but regardless, there was a bill that was put together that would allow for the establishment of these and then allow for the creation of these kinds of facilities. A city or a county could do that on their own and say, we want to do this and have that. But it also allows for, there's a board that's been established that looks this over, that it or one of these other state development authorities like Point of the Mountain or like the Inland Port Authority, they could also do that designation. That became a bit of a contentious issue because the question was, well, so what input does the city or the county where they want to locate that, what input do they get on this? And that kind of went back and forth a little bit, and there is language in there now that says that it has to comply with plans. It doesn't say local plans, it just says with plans. What does that mean exactly? I don't know. That's something that I'm sure we're going to hear more about in coming sessions. You can see some of the other things there. Several of these were Salt Lake City specific. So, interesting stuff, because it may well drive what happens in Salt Lake and why we may all want to go to Salt Lake more or not more, depending, but just be aware of those. All right, coming for the next year, and the league in their session talked a little bit more about this, but some of you may recall there was this whole big discussion that came right at the end of the session about something called the Beehive Development Authority. This was the idea of having some kind of a state designated or a state authorized entity that could determine what would be a project of statewide significance. And then they could establish an area, and then they basically, in that area, they take over all jurisdiction and responsibility. Land use, taxation, everything else. All right? That kicked off quite a bit of discussion right at the end of the session, enough so that it sank the bill for the session, but the whole issue may not be done yet. It may be coming back in some form or another. There will likely be more zoning reform. The discussions are just getting kicked off. Certainly the state housing plan will be one forum for this, the land use task force, the Commission on Housing Affordability. There seems to be more of a inclination to say, all right, we've done all the easy stuff. Other states are doing hard stuff like saying, you can't have any more single-family residential zones in your city or in your state. That's been happening in some states. That's been talked about here, that you have to allow lots down to a certain size. That's been happening in other states. It's been talked about here. There was actually a bill in the last session that would have done that. So there are some other proposals like that. Another big one that's kind of might be an issue is whether we become what's called a mandatory general plan compliance state. As you all well know, right now in the state of Utah, general plans are considered to be advisory only. They do not have to be complied with. Some states do have doctrines that say you must be compliant with your general plan in your land use regulations and zoning. There's been discussion about making Utah a compliant state. That would change the whole way we would do our general plans and the way we look at them and where the land use fights are going to take place. So, Ted?
Wilf, what do you think about that?
As a planner, it sounds like a good idea. As a practical realist, it's going to take a while to get there because it will change the way communities do and need to do their general plans. And then what it's going to mean ultimately about how they get implemented. Not yet. I want to see the particulars. I think the concept's not bad, but it really depends on the details. It depends on how it gets put into action. One of the things that I've seen in the research that I have done is I think a lot of people think that either you are a plan that or a state that requires plan compliance, or you're a state that doesn't. It's an on-off switch. It's not an on-off switch. There's a spectrum. You can have sort of compliance, you can have compliance with certain things, you can have total compliance. It all is on a spectrum. Where on that spectrum should we land? And I think we need to have some discussion about that, and we haven't had that discussion. And until we do, I don't know whether I would support it or not. That's my own personal opinion. I think on annexation in other states has been a good tool for managing growth. Certainly one arrow to have in the quiver to deal with growth. We have not been doing that effectively at all in the state of Utah. When I was coordinating a working group on annexation, which is what resulted in the bill that was passed this session, we all wanted to get into discussions about how annexation could work better to deal with future growth. But we decided that we shouldn't and couldn't do that. Otherwise, we would make the bill too controversial and we probably wouldn't get anything passed. And what we really needed passed first was just a cleanup of the existing law. So the cleanup's now been passed. I think we need to get back to the discussion on annexation about how to make it work better, like extraterritorial jurisdiction for communities or limitations on what development can happen adjacent to a community that they have not yet annexed but intend to annex in the future. Questions like that. Gravel pits will almost surely become another issue in this next legislative session. And the state housing plan will be one of those factors that, along with the Land Use Task Force and the Commission on Housing Affordability, that will certainly play into what legislation we're going to get. Now, the thing is, many planners and many elected officials I have heard them say, there has been so much passed by the legislature over the last few years, we can't keep up. We're having a hard time, and we don't know whether the things that have been passed in the last couple of years, whether they're even working or having any effect. Why don't we just pause for a while? Let us get caught up. Let's see if things work. Makes sense to do that. The league has been very good about trying to say that, more forcefully at the legislative level. I can pretty much tell you right now it ain't going to happen this next year. We're not going to get a pause. I'm kind of hearing about things. So in 2006, when I told you that there was quite a substantial change to LUDMA and the way it was written and the character it's in, that was the result of something that happened in that year that we called the nuclear option. We had a president of the Senate at that time who was president of the National Association of Realtors. And he was also very much into this, don't fetter us much with these kinds of rules and regulations to be able to do land use development. And he threw out a bill as president of the Senate. He could do this, and he had kind of had enough of hearing from locals and so on. He threw out a bill that almost would have completely gutted local land use enabling legislation. That's why we called it the nuclear option. Set off a huge furor. And ultimately, there was another bill that was crafted that he wound up finally supporting that gave us the LUDMA that was the character, what it was in 2006, that kind of is the structure we have now. We've added so much to it now, it's kind of hard to find the original in there. But that was what happened at that time. That was a really big deal. And as a result of that, part of the discussion was we need to quit having these big fights at the legislature during the legislative session, because you really can't talk through a lot of these issues in that kind of a setting. That's what started the Land Use Task Force. The Land Use Task Force, where you had local government representatives getting together with development representatives and talking about land use issues and coming to some kind of an agreement. And that has functioned pretty well now for nearly 20 years. It's kind of waned over the last couple of years. It waned somewhat, but it's still there. And I think it actually worked pretty well this last year. But that was all happened because of what happened with that big nuclear option back in 2006. I'm not going to say it's a nuclear option, but I'll tell you what, I'm hearing a lot of rumblings this year of big stuff. I'm hearing a lot of rumblings about things that may change substantially in the way that we do land use in the state of Utah. And part of that being driven by taking a look and seeing what's happening in other states around the country right now in reaction to the housing affordability crisis. And we certainly have that. We're one of the states that are being most affected by that, and yet we have not gone as far as many of these other states have. I think we're going to see some things happen in this next legislative session. So on that optimistic note, I am done. And I know that many of you may have questions. I think, Jason, you're going to come up and take this, and I think we might have a little bit of a round table for those who may want to stick around afterwards, but we shall see. Jason?
Jason's going to come up in just a moment, but for those that are leaving right now, if you could please take our survey. We'll have it linked on the website. Not going to shut the doors and lock you in until you do, but I'm tempted. No, I'm kidding. Please just take the survey so we can continue making these conferences great and really get your feedback. It's very important to us. So give Jason just a minute and we will. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. He's ready.
Sorry, technical issues. Thank you all for sticking around to the end. Really appreciate your attendance and the opportunity to visit with you. And I hope you've had the opportunity and taken the opportunity to visit with others about the sessions, about what's going on in your communities, about the challenges you're facing. And I also wanted to thank Logan in Cache County for being great hosts. As you leave, I hope I issued 2 challenges this week at the conference. The first was to share your inspirations. I hope you've been able to share with each other, and I hope as you go home, you will share what has inspired you, the thoughts that you've had, the questions that you have. We have the opportunity as planners in this state to work together and to bounce ideas off each other and to learn and grow with each other. And let's utilize that and continue to cultivate that. And then the second challenge was to don't accept being stuck. If you're running into a challenge, if you're running into a question, reach out. We have tons of resources available that are available to all of our members. We have the forum, we have obviously emails and contacts, and we're always looking for new content and new sessions, new educational opportunities. And so if you're running into issues, let us know so that we can work to help give you the resources you need to get those answered. Just a few reminders. We've asked for the PowerPoints. We will be putting those presentations and making them available. So if there were sessions that you were not able to make, please do that. The call for sessions for fall is open, and so if there was a topic or subject you felt was missed that you'd really like to hear, let us know, and we can work on a call for a session on that topic. The award nominations are also open if there's projects, individuals in your communities that you feel should be recognized. please, as Megan mentioned, please fill out this survey. This is so important for us as we're planning our future conferences and our webinars and other events throughout the year, to know and understand where we're hitting the mark, where we're missing the mark, what we can do better, what we did well, so that we can continue to improve these things to add value to your membership and to attending these conferences. This is available on our website. Just a few quick reminders of upcoming events. I did highlight the June 6th event. We do have more information, and it is on the website now under our announcements, and there will be more information coming on that social opportunity on June 6th. And then in October, the dates 9th and 10th in Salt Lake will be our fall conference. Finally, sorry, Nikki is not here. She's left, but if we can give her a round of applause, even though she's not here. For those of you that know, Nikki, these conferences, well, and those of you that don't know, these conferences would not happen without her. And the effort and time and energy she puts in to making sure everything runs so smoothly for us. And we're so lucky to have her on staff to help us with these events. Also, thank you to the Conference Planning Committee and our presenters for the time and effort and energy that went in. I heard nothing but good things, and hopefully that's what the survey shows as well, good things about the conference. But if we can give a quick round of applause to our conference committee and our presenters and all those that spent time here this week. And last but not least, to our sponsors. We are a nonprofit organization. We rely on our membership, but we also heavily rely on our sponsorships and grant opportunities to help fund events like this. And so without the sponsors, we wouldn't be able to provide the programming that we're able to provide and have conferences like this. And so thank you to all of our sponsors. And once again, thank you for attending. Please fill out the survey. I will go back to that in case you didn't grab it before. And we look forward to hearing from you. Please travel safe, and thank you.